From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti and Adrian Carrendo will discuss dryland corn planting adjustments. Amid the expectations of a dry growing season, they'll look specifically at making changes in plant density at seeding and modifying nitrogen application rates at planting time. Also, K-State's Jeff Whitworth with his latest scouting report on insects in alfalfa and winter wheat. Around Kansas, he has advice on responding to a variety of aphids now showing up in wheat, and he updates his recommendation on contending with weevils in alfalfa ahead of the first cutting. Later then, K-State's Gus van Der Hoeven with another commentary on life in rural Kansas. Here on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we're glad to have you aboard on this Wednesday. Well, you corn growers are battling all sorts of decisions right now with the weather not cooperating necessarily well, dry conditions, leading you to maybe think about adjustments in your dryland corn seeding. We have brought by today from the Department of Agronomy, Research and Extension Cropping Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti, and a postdoc researcher in the department working with Ignacio, Adrian Carrendo. They're going to share some of their thoughts on what might be practical in adjusting corn planting right now. And Ignacio, you're getting questions from producers about what they might do to compensate for dry soils. And one of those things, you have this article that you just recently wrote for the Agronomy E-Update newsletter on changing or adjusting the density of the planting.
Yeah, as always, Eric, thanks for the invitation. Plant density, and Adrian will explain about the similar situation with nitrogen. Plant density is really connected to yield potential in many situations. We explain many times, for yielding more, we need more plants. It has been the genetic progress, crop improvement for corn, the last 50 years, more yield, more plants in the field. So it's a linear relationship, or very, very similar to a linear relationship. So for many farmers out there, what this implies is that if I want to get to a higher attainable yield on my environment, my farm, I usually will need to increase number of plants until the optimum, right? The main point that we clarify on this article is that that optimum is not a number. Many situations, farmers are expecting to see my optimal plant density might be 24,000 seeds per acre, and maybe 22,000 plants, if you want to go to plants per acre. And then when you start looking at numbers, we have on-farm studies showing that optimal, that 22 could be a year, could be 18, another year could be 24, another year could be 21. It's a moving target. Our main point is to clarify to those farmers, in a year that you're starting with quite dry soils, projections of lack of rain and high temperature in the summer, it could be one of those years that you start thinking about how adjusting early season, before you plant, the input of density can be a factor that could be beneficial. If you cut on densities, most likely if you cut close to the optimal, so if we are between 4,000 or 5,000 seeds per acre on the optimal, we will be probably close to get still very good yields. But we will put that crop into a situation that if you have a stress condition, it will not suffer that much. Because by adding more plants, and if we add more plants than the optimal, we are putting that crop into needing more water, increasing and growing faster, and then putting that crop into a stress situation. So this is one of the practices that we can adjust. The article shows how we start to use some of the last 10-year data on building these probabilistic models. And our models show that if you look at the state of Kansas, most of the counties that we were projecting changes on plant density are showing that we should be cutting. In some situations, it's not much, 2,000 or 4,000 seeds per acre. Okay, so you're always finishing very close to the optimal. If your optimal was 24,000, you might finish with 20,000 plants. But we want to make sure that the farmers understand that it's not a number, that you are still within that error. And in many situations, yes, we might leave some potential yield on the table, but I'd rather play a little bit more safe on this year than trying to chase something that is kind of a missing target.
And again, in this article, you have a map depicting county by county what adjustments might be appropriate for the current dryness. And that's a really handy tool that folks can find at the Agronomy e-update site, and we'll remind you how to get there in just a few moments. So planting density, one thing. Let's bring Adrian in here and talk about nitrogen adjustments that one might make if they are applying with the seed at planting time. We all know how extraordinarily expensive nitrogen has become. With the dry conditions, it makes, Adrian, a producer, think twice perhaps about the rates they're going with at planting with their N.
Yeah, sure. First of all, Eric, thank you very much for the invitation today. And yeah, nitrogen is one of the most concerning inputs this year. On the one side, we have the price that is quite high, more than $1 a pound of nitrogen. So we want to maximize each pound that we put on the ground. For that, this is not a year to broadcast nitrogen first. If you're going to apply, try to incorporate the nitrogen because we need it in the soil. If you broadcast the nitrogen, you may suffer problems such as volatilization, and we don't want that nitrogen going to the air. You want that nitrogen going to the soil, and that you have more opportunities to being uptaken by the crop. The second thing is about the crop rotation. This is a very special year to pay attention to the previous crop that you have in the field. This is not a year to put corn over corn or corn over wheat, because you will have certainly a drop on your yields because you may suffer immobilization of the nitrogen that is on the soil. Remember that the straw of a cereal has a carbon-nitrogen relationship that is not promoting the release of nitrogen from the residues, and in fact it will immobilize the nitrogen that is being released from the organic matter. So in that sense, if you put a corn in a field that it has soybean as a previous crop, you will probably have 20 to 30 bushels extra just because of the previous crop. Again, this is just, as Ignacio was telling before, this is just an average number that you may consider. This may vary depending on different conditions on your soils and your specific field, such as the water holding capacity that you have in your field. You have a sandy texture, you most likely have limitations related to water that it will also limit the mineralization of organic matter. So regarding to that, if you have a soil with low organic matter and it's sandy, you will likely have a low supply of nitrogen from the soil. That's a second factor to pay attention. So in that case, you will be more dependent on the nitrogen you put as a fertilizer to your crop. And again, if you need to put nitrogen, normally the economic optimum rates across the Midwest are about 150 pounds. Probably with that amount, you are already kind of maximizing yields at the economic level. But again, this is just a number that most likely have an uncertainty which is about 40 to 50 pounds. So if you hear that the optimum of nitrogen is, for example, 150 pounds, that could be between 110 and 190. So again, this is a year to pay attention to those boundaries, and probably we may want to go based on the price to the low end of that boundary. Yeah. So probably targeting 110 pounds. It could be a safeguard, right? And then you will check your crop. If you see that you are B5, B6, and the crop is needing the nitrogen, you are seeing yellow-greens with the V-shape, inverted V-shape on the lowest leaves, probably you need to apply some nitrogen. But this is a year to wait. So if you apply nitrogen early, just apply some, and then you may wait until before B5 to see if you may need some extra nitrogen. But the advice is to be cautious with that and not put all the nitrogen. With the forecast we have, probably the nitrogen won't go anywhere because it's dry. So if you already put nitrogen, let's say many farmers already put the nitrogen the previous fall because of the prices, the nitrogen won't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. It will be there. But probably if you put 150 pounds, probably you are a little high. So you save on the price per pound of nitrogen, but probably you put more than the crop needed. So those are some of the tips to pay attention this season.
And those are the things that, what Adrian is telling is that similar to what we discussed on plant density, the fertilization of the nitrogen needs of the plant, it relates to the yield. If the plant will have a 200 bushel yield target, you will need that extra nitrogen. If you are in a year that your target is only 120, in a worst-case scenario, having more nitrogen could be even detrimental. It's similar to having extra density, Having that extra density or extra nitrogen, it could be detrimental because you build a plant that will need more water, and the moment that you need that flowering, you will not have that water available, and that could be the main issue. So thinking these connections of inputs, how they are connected to your attainable yield, and everything going back to the forecast. And one of the last points that we can emphasize, is also think about the planting date. This is one of the years that I'm not in a rush to put all my corn right now. I'm just thinking that if I have my chances, I will try to spread it out as much as possible, right? To potentially have a really optimal growing season by planting too early is very, very low in many environments. We're talking about specifically on the central part, on the western part of the state. We already demonstrated in many situations in our research too, is that we can move that planting date even towards mid-May or even late May, and still we have a successful planting window. And in many places, we tend to have more stability. Of course, we lose on the yield potential. For many of the guys that are trying to target for high yields, maybe not the best idea. But for many of the rest of the mortals that we are trying just to go on the 150 plus, they have still a very open window for planting corn. And this is a year that we might need to think very carefully and make sure that we have some rain, some soil moisture, just to make sure that we can plant this corn and get really good uniformity.
There's this article on the plant density angle in the Agronomy e-Update newsletter. Check that out. It's good reference at agronomy.ksu.edu. Adrian, good to have you here. Ignacio, likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
K-State agronomists Ignacio Ciampitti and Adrian Carrendo with us on this part of Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. As insects go, things are happening in our alfalfa and wheat stands out there right now. And our guest is keeping us up on the latest and how to respond to it in a management sense. Jeff Whitworth is a crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension. He's along frequently here in the springtime to keep us on top of these insect pests and what measures you producers might take, if any, to address them. Jeff, you say that alfalfa weevils deserve yet another look here.
That's right. Good morning. The two crops that we have going right now and still have going and will have for another month or so probably, at least as far as pests are concerned, are wheat and alfalfa. Right. It's been kind of a strange spring, late winter, early spring so far. It hasn't been really cold, hasn't been really warm, and as far as the alfalfa goes, the alfalfa is developing, but not as fast as it usually does. And that's the same for the alfalfa weevil. We'll talk about alfalfa first because there is a lot of spraying going on right now for alfalfa weevils. I've been around central Kansas the last couple of days. Probably 70% of the fields are treated that are going to be treated, and one of the reasons why is because the weather has been relatively free of precipitation, which is not good, but it has been really windy, but they've gotten a lot of spraying or treating or applications done a little bit early maybe. So what we've been thinking is you want to make sure after you treat your alfalfa for alfalfa, we will go back and check it after the reentry interval for whatever product you use for alfalfa weevils because they're still hatching. So if you treated 2 weeks ago, the residual activity of the product you use probably going to last 10 to 14 days. The alfalfa hopefully will start putting on new vegetation, which won't have any residual on it anyway. So you just need to go back and check after the reentry interval, like I said, for whatever product you use for alfalfa weevils. This may be a year where 2 or 3 applications, I hate to say it, but 2 or 3 applications may be more usual than in past years. And there's also quite a few aphids out there. As I've been out in the last couple of days with these strong southern breezes, the aphids are landing on me. So we know they're still being blown into the state or around in the state, and they're coming on the alfalfa, and they're also getting on the wheat. On the alfalfa, the aphids we're finding are pea aphids, which is usual for early season alfalfa, but kind of unusual are cowpea aphids. And the cowpea aphids are the dark gray, black, waxy colored aphids They maybe are a little easier to see than the pea aphids because the pea aphids are greenish color. They blend in a little better with the alfalfa. But those are the two aphids that we're seeing in alfalfa. A treatment for alfalfa weevils takes care of the aphids also. It kills the aphids. One of the problems with that, it kills the aphids, but it will also kill any beneficials that are out there. This year so far, I've not seen an overabundance of beneficials, lady beetles, lacewings, etc. yet. There are a few, but there's not too many. So once you spray your alfalfa, that's going to kill the weevils, that's going to kill the aphids, and it's going to kill the beneficials. The problem, as I said, these aphids are continuing to migrate in, and they are parthenogenic, which means each individual aphid can produce other aphids, and they're all females, so they don't have to mate, they don't have to wait and lay eggs, they don't have to wait for the eggs to develop. They're just constantly and consistently producing female aphids, and after about 7 to 10 days, those females can reproduce also. So that's why aphid colonies will rebound or come back a lot quicker than the beneficials for the most part. So you want to make sure after you spray your alfalfa, go back after the reentry interval and check your alfalfa for weevils and for the aphids. Again, I have a hard time recommending treating just for aphids because the aphids really do help host beneficials, i.e. the lady beetles, the green lacewings, some of the little parasitic wasps that are out there. So if there's any aphids out there, they will find those, and that way those beneficials can also have a food source to reproduce on for later in the year. So just if you need to spray again for weevils, you got to get out and check. Again, the retreatment is about 30%, 35% to 50% infestation. Might trigger a retreatment because these weevils, they're feeding anytime. It's been cool, but they're feeding anytime the temperature's above 45 degrees. From about 45 to 80 degrees, weevils are feeding. So even when it gets down into the 45, 50 degree temperature at night, the weevils will still be feeding. So that's why they can do a lot of damage quite quickly if they're left untreated.
While on the subject of aphids, there's a different assortment of aphids now present in winter wheat, you say?
Yes, winter wheat's the other crop that's actively growing. Well, maybe not quite as actively as we wish it would. We just need some moisture. Moisture will help a lot, significant rain. But right now we are seeing 3 different species of aphids in the wheat crop. The main 2, bird trioed aphid and green bugs, those are quite common. The English grain aphid, that's another one. There are a few Russian aphids around, but the main 2 that we have a problem with year after year is the bird trioed aphid and the green bug. Again, if you're out in your wheat or your alfalfa or you're just out in your garden on these days when you have a pretty strong southern breeze, you're probably going to have some aphids land on you because they're being blown in from the southern part of the state or Oklahoma, Texas, wherever they're coming from. So they're continuing to do that. When they land on the wheat, just like the aphids in the alfalfa, they are, again, parthenogenic. They will start feeding, and they will start producing young. They suck the juice out of the wheat. The wheat right now, in most parts of the state, is competing for what little moisture there is in the soil. So anything that feeds on the moisture inside the plant is actually going to exacerbate the damage to that plant. It's going to cause it to be more highly visible, and we're getting a lot of calls about feeding damage on wheat. The primary pests that we're seeing have been at least mites. There's 2 different kinds of mites, wintergrain mites and brown wheat mite that we've been seeing quite a bit around the state, plus the aphids. Each will suck the juice out of the plant. It takes quite a few to cause economic damage to a wheat plant. The wheat's really good at compensating for this damage. But if we don't get any more moisture between now and the next month with these mites and these aphids both competing for the plant moisture, it could be a tough go for the plants. All it takes is a good rain. I've seen, we get a good thunderstorm, and a lot of guys have asked me, well, how much rain, how hard? Yeah, I don't know. Just a good thunderstorm will clean these things off of them, and they won't come back. I really think we're about through with the mites just naturally because of their biology. As the temperatures transition and get a little more warm out there during the day, these mites are going to quit feeding. So, yeah, I've never seen them go past mid to late April, actually. Again, every year's a little bit different, but I just can't see this year being different. So if you're considering a miticide, I probably would recommend holding off. I just think these mites are going to finish feeding on their own, or hopefully we'll get a thunderstorm, and it will clean them up, and it will also help clean up the aphids. Plus, it will help the plants be able to better survive or better overcome the feeding caused by these mites, because remember, what they're doing is competing for that plant's moisture. So as the roots struggle to pull up the moisture, the feeding causes more problems. So I hope we're about through with the problem that the mites cause, and the aphids can still be there, but I'm hoping the beneficials will build up sufficiently in the next couple of weeks or 3 weeks to help control those also.
And just for clarification, if one decides to treat for aphids, that won't do much against mites.
I would not recommend treating for aphids also in wheat. That's a good point. I've gotten several questions about adding an insecticide to an already scheduled fungicide application or fertilizer application, just in case there's some aphids out there. We always recommend against that. Yeah, you can kill the aphids. Yeah, just about whatever will kill the mites will kill the aphids, but you also kill all the beneficials. Like I said, generally speaking, there aren't enough aphids to actually retard or reduce the actual yield of the wheat. In the last 22 years, we put out plots 4 or 5 different times for winter grain mites, and twice for brown wheat mites, and many times for aphids. And every time we've gotten a rain within a couple of weeks of putting out those plots. So we clean up the infestation. You put the insecticide out, it kills the pest, and then you have an untreated one or unsprayed, and then it rains. And by the time we get ready to harvest, you can't tell the difference. So these plants are really good at compensating for any of this early season feeding damage we may have.
Really is good to know, given the economics of the day and costs of inputs being what they are. Be very judicious about any control measures you take. And Jeff, we'll have you back soon as the weather warms up, so will insect activity in our field crops, one would imagine. Thank you for now.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you, Eric.
That's Jeff Whitworth. He's a crop entomologist with K-State Research and Extension and regularly updating us on insect issues in our crops here on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
It cracked the windshield, but sadder, it killed the owl.
That's Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Years ago, while driving to the farm, an owl dove down from a tree and smashed into my windshield. It cracked the windshield, but sadder, it killed the owl. I know this happens quite often, and I wonder why. I know turkeys can do a lot of damage to a windshield, but a turkey's flight is more straight ahead than that of the owl. If I see a flock of turkeys beside the road and I see them take off when I approach in the truck, I slow down. The turkey which flies way ahead of the truck is no problem. It tends to veer away from the truck. If the windows are open, you can hear the heavy flapping of the wings. But the turkey or turkeys which seek their escape by flying across the road are an immediate threat. I always slow down to give them time. It's a heavy bird. They take off like a loaded cargo plane. The owl, which dove into my windshield on a clear day, is for me a mystery. Why did he or she dive down? It was the barred owl. I hated its demise, but there was nothing I could do. Later I replaced the windshield. I still remember when it happened and where it happened, and as I drive by that spot, I still wonder why. The quick and sudden experience was totally different from what happened the other day on the hill. I had seen a barred owl around the house. Not like last year when I watched a female owl catch a rabbit just in front of us while we were drinking tea on the deck. That was an outdoor drama. The big owl trying to lift off with the heavy rabbit. I filmed it on my smartphone. The owl did haul the caught rabbit away, dragging it with flapping wings. But the other day, as I briefly stepped outside, 2 owls flew over, very low and slow, and with a smooth sweep up, settled in 2 trees next to me. They were so low, I clearly saw their eyes and markings. The bigger one, the female. They caught me by surprise. As they drifted over, they screeched to each other, or were they telling me something? It felt like a Harry Potter movie. Actually, an unnatural close encounter. It's not unnatural for the barred owl to fly and hunt during daytime. Ever since that day, though, I haven't seen them. But I know there is good habitat with dense deciduous trees, with sparse undergrowth and enough wildlife to eat. There are a few hollow trees which would provide good nesting sites. But a simple nesting box with a large opening nailed on a tree will do the trick of housing them. I do not know if this pair nests on the hill or in the neighborhood, but whatever, I'm glad they are still around. I like to think that the pair I saw so low were introducing themselves and telling me, "We are your neighbors. Welcome."
Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas, featured every Wednesday right here. And with that, our time's away once more. We appreciate you tuning in and hope you'll be right back with us this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.